Hey friends, I'm glad you joined me today. I've got a book I want to share today, and it's a great book. It's one of my favorites, and it's written by a friend of mine and illustrated by another friend of mine. It's called, this is it, it's Mr. Tuck and the 13 Heroes, a true story. And it's a beautiful story about some really brave people. You may know this book. If you don't, you should. It's written by Sophie Harris and illustrated by Sophie Harris. And it's a true story, like it says in the title. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's see what it says. All right. So it's Mr. Tuck and the 13 Heroes, a true story by Sophie Harris, illustrated by Sophie Harris. It's hard to believe now, but there was a time in our country's history when white children and black children could not go to school together. Things started to change for the better in 1954 when the Supreme Court said that it was against the law to separate the students. Some places took longer than others to start changing. Henry County in Georgia was one of those places. In 1966, the court finally ordered Henry County to integrate, to let black children and white children go to the same school. Many people in Henry County did not like this. Since they had to do it, they decided to let it happen in just one school. That school was going to be Fairview Elementary. A man named Mr. Tuck was the principal. Before Mr. Tuck came to Fairview, it was the school that was in the worst shape of all the white schools in the county. Mr. Tuck wanted to change that. He and his wife did a lot of work to make it look better. They even put new paint on the walls themselves. Under Mr. Tuck's leadership, Fairview became a very good school. Mr. Tuck believed that all children should be able to go to a good school. When the county needed one school to let the children attend, Mr. Tuck quickly volunteered Fairview. How did the other people look at the table? What do you think? This made many white people in the Fairview area very mad, and they did some mean things to Mr. Tuck's family. They called his house and said terrible things. They painted mean words on the road outside his house. They tried to scare the family by saying that there was a bomb in their car. They even threatened to hurt Mr. Tuck's son, Mike. All of this was very difficult for Mr. Tuck and his family, but he knew he was doing the right thing. When black families were given the chance to send their students to Fairview, only a few families responded, 13 children in all. Mr. Tuck and the 13 Heroes, I bet those are the heroes. We'll see. The school that the black children attended was in terrible shape. The books were old and missing pages, the desks were broken, the building was falling apart. The families of the 13 children wanted their sons and daughters to have something better, even though they knew that changing schools would be very hard for them. The weeks leading up to the first day of school were very difficult. There were lots of loud, mean-spirited protests. What does the sign say? Can you read it? But it says no integration. The biggest protest was on the first day of school itself. Early that morning, hundreds of people lined the sidewalk at the school. When the bus carrying the 13 black children arrived, the children could hear and see the people shouting at them. A few people had guns and ropes, holding them up to intimidate the children. The children were so scared. As they looked over the crowd toward the school, they could see a man step through the front door. Many of the students recognized the man as Mr. Tuck, the white man who they had heard was going to be their principal. The crowd insulted and threatened Mr. Tuck as he walked toward the bus. Mr. Tuck stepped onto the bus and spoke to the frightened children. "Boys and girls," he said, "this is your school. I'm Mr. Tuck, your principal. We're going to get through this together," he said. "I'm so glad you're here." Mr. Tuck took the hand of one of the girls up front. The two of them stepped off the bus and walked hand in hand up the walk toward the school. Once the little girl was safely inside the building, Mr. Tuck stepped back outside, locked the door behind him, and went back toward the bus. What was he going to do? Mr. Tuck made 13 trips to the bus that morning. He held the hands of the students, and he even carried some of the smaller ones. The children arrived safely to school, and Fairview Elementary was integrated at long last. The next few weeks and months were still very hard for Mr. Tuck and the 13 children, but things did get better gradually. Years later, let me show you this picture. Things did get better eventually. Years later, when Mr. Tuck was asked about his experiences that day, he said, "This is not my story. This is the children's story. They were the real heroes that day." Many years after that memorable morning, Mr. Tuck became sick and had to go to the hospital. He did get better, but he had to stay there for a while. He drifted in and out of sleep frequently during his stay in the hospital. He was not aware of much, but he could tell that there were many doctors and visitors coming and going. As the days went on, he noticed that there was a particular nurse named Melinda who was in the room a lot, sometimes during the day and sometimes late at night. "You are in here all the time," he said to the nurse. "I've got plenty of people here to take care of me. You should go home and get some rest." Melinda smiled. "Mr. Tuck, you don't recognize me, but I sure do know you. You held my hand and walked with me to my first day at Fairview Elementary. You didn't leave me on that day, and I'm not leaving you." "We'll get through this together," she said. Mr. Tuck smiled at her and said, "I'm so glad you're here." And that's the end. So what do you think of the story? The book is Mr. Tuck and the 13 Heroes. And those 13 children sure were brave and heroic, doing something that was really scary. Mr. Tuck was a hero too, I think. And I hope that you enjoyed the story and that you'll think about it as I will today. If you want to find this book, you can find it on Amazon, and if you live in Greenville, South Carolina, you can find it at M. Judson Bookstore. But it's a wonderful book, and I hope you liked it. Thanks. See ya.